So then we will turn to the material again. So we are in the section we had talked about last time, the obstacles to calm abiding, the arising primarily of the different levels of laxity and excitement. And then we talked about applying the remedies when laxity and excitement arise. We need to notice that our meditation has been affected by the arising of laxity or excitement, either a dullness of the mind or a over brightening, over excitement of the mind, and counteract that state that is problematic. So when the mind becomes too lax, and the sharpness of the meditation is lost, the intensity is lost, there's a sense of heaviness, then we can, as we said, there's different levels of that. The coarsest level would mean that we completely lose the object entirely, or even if the object remains, it's not as intense, as sharp as it ought to be, as it would be useful or necessary, particularly in terms of cultivating calm abiding, for it to be. And so he says, for example, if we've taken the visual image of the Buddha as our meditation object for developing calm abiding, which is common, he says, to brighten or elevate the object of meditation. So we talked about how if you do that, you do visualize the image of the Buddha to be emanating light, so you can increase the intensity of that brightness, or to try to pay close attention, he says, to individual details of the object. So instead of just thinking of the object as a whole, try to really zero in on the eyes, the nose, the lips, the earlobes, the different parts of the visualization, and really try to narrow your focus to bring back that kind of grip in the mind to the object, because with laxity the object has become dull. And then sometimes he says we, of course, when we're meditating, we choose an object and we're intended to only use that object. But if we find that it's really not working, if there's just too much laxity in the mind for that session to be productive, then we can stop that session and go to a different object that is going to uplift the mind. So that could be thinking about, the qualities of your teacher. That could be thinking about the preciousness of perfect human rebirth, or it could be aspiring to develop perfect love, perfect compassion, perfect bodhicitta, the incredible benefits, all of these things that will uplift the mind and perhaps provide more conducive conditions to going back to then that object that you're using for developing calm abiding, and be better prepared to have a mind that's not heavy and dull and lax in terms of its ability to concentrate. Okay. And then when the mind is the opposite, is experiencing the opposite obstacle of excitement, then the mind is kind of shooting off here and there, and it's difficult to rein in. So here we need to withdraw the mind and make it come under our control more effectively. So one way, instead of brightening the image of the Buddha, if that's the object that you're using, we talked about before how we're meant to relate to that object as having some weight to it. And so here you could increase your sense of its mass, not by increasing its size, but by just relating to it as if it were more dense than previously you were relating to it. That will help to ground the mind. Or the alternative is, again, leaving that session and engaging in a separate session which is different than before because the nature of the obstacle is different. So here you would try to sober up the mind because with excitement, the mind is very ping-ponging off of different things. It's very distracted. And if you maybe did a short contemplation on death, for example, then, or, the disadvantages of remaining in cyclic existence, something that kind of sobers up the mind and helps you to kind of give yourself a little mini wake-up call. And then, because sort of like, what am I doing? I need to really get to work here, so I don't have time for distraction. So some kind of topic that serves that purpose for you. And then again, once you've kind of reminded yourself of that, then you can go back to the object. Here the example would be the visual image of the Buddha. Okay. And then His Holiness talks about over application, which has different meanings depending on the level of calm abiding that you've accomplished. But generally, we don't want to always be applying an antidote to laxity or excitement. We want to make sure that we stop applying once we have addressed the arising of excitement, the arising of laxity. By applying an antidote, then we stop applying that antidote and we just focus on the object. And then, of course, if laxity or excitement arise again, then again, we need to apply the antidote, but we don't just apply it continuously throughout the entire session. They say that forgetting for people who are newer to meditation, then forgetting to apply the antidote is the real danger. It becomes increasingly more likely as you progress that you might be over applying the antidotes because you're naturally getting better at holding on to the object, but you kind of have a history of not holding to the object. So you've become accustomed to applying antidotes. And so you kind of are in that habit, and it becomes something to think about more and more as you progress, whether it's really necessary or whether you've kind of exaggerated or over anticipated moving off of the object. Because applying antidotes when there's no real reason to is in and of itself a distraction, a problem for really, really clear, focused attention. Okay. So now there's I can pause. Any thoughts or questions so far? Nope. All right. So then there's a little section here called Levels of Progress Toward Calm Abiding, where His Holiness is going to give us some descriptions of these 9 levels. And so I think I've mentioned that, I think you'd have to say that this idea of 9 levels of calm abiding is kind of arbitrary. You could come up with different descriptions, different conceptual descriptions of each of the levels, and then you could have more than 9 or fewer than 9 because you are just defining it. It's really a continuous spectrum of progress toward developing calm abiding, but how you slice that up kind of is made up, kind of arbitrary. But this is the system that we have, and so these are the descriptions that we use to kind of judge where we are in relation to fully qualified calm abiding. So the first level is called putting the mind. And he says, when after hearing or reading instructions, you initially draw the mind inside and try to put it on the object. So here, the idea is that we understand the distinction between meditating and daydreaming. We understand that the goal is to cause an object of meditation to arise, to attempt to hold the mind onto the object, and to notice the arising of distraction, which we would define as anything other than the intended object or the chosen object, and then to not indulge in the arising of distraction, but to give ourselves the instruction, at least, of noticing the distraction and moving the mind back again and again and again. So this is basically just a very, very beginner level, but at least we understand kind of the philosophy of what meditation is meant to be, how we're kind of meant to work with it, and we're making an effort to follow that instruction. So there's here it's kind of regardless of how many distractions arise, how often the distractions arise. That's not really relevant at this point. What's relevant is that we grasp the point of what we're doing, and we are just making a genuine effort to not follow the arising of distraction. But then level 2 is what we will progress into if we persist. And he says, when we employ mindfulness by noticing the arising of distraction and kind of watching our sessions of meditation and trying to notice as quickly as possible that when the mind has strayed to something else, to a distraction, then he says, you become able to put your mind on the object for brief periods, though there is still more distraction than there is attention to the object. He says during these first 2 levels, you're working on getting your mind on the object, not really keeping it there. So this is, of course, in the very first level, what we'll find is that we spend, if it's a 10-minute meditation, we might find that, 7 or 8 minutes, 9 minutes of that was kind of, if we added it all up, was something other than the intended object. But here on the second level, there are these at least brief periods where he says, rambling thought sometimes takes a rest and sometimes suddenly arises. So at least there's a quieting, a little bit of a quieting of the mind here, where the intended object is something that for these brief moments at least we can hold to. And then as we continue to apply that introspective awareness of really clearly giving ourselves the instruction to notice distraction and to move the mind back to the object, then we will find naturally that instead of recognizing, 5 minutes after we've been engaged in some story, some conceptual story about what someone said to us or did to us, or what we would rather be doing, we will notice more and more quickly after that first moment of the mind moving off of the object. So he says at this level, the third level, he says mindfulness has now matured to the point where you immediately recognize distraction. So as soon as the mind shifts, so we haven't prevented the mind from shifting to something other than the intended object, but here at least it doesn't persist for long periods. The moment the mind moves to a distraction, that becomes apparent to the mind, and we're able to then put the mind back. And then on the fourth level is called close placement. He says, due to the full maturation of mindfulness, you are able immediately to counter laziness and forgetfulness. And now you're on, once that happens, you're on the fourth level, where it's not possible to lose the object through a sense of forgetfulness, like, oh, what was I supposed to do? Like, what was I, what was this session of meditation supposed to be on? That is completely abandoned on the fourth level. And he says coarse excitement is also overcome, but subtle excitement is still there, which interferes without causing us to completely lose the object. He says now on the first three levels, laziness and forgetfulness were the main problems, but now laxity and excitement have become the real concerns. So there's still, because we talked about those subtler levels of laxity and excitement, where the object might be present in the mind, but it's not sharply in focus, or there's kind of just a busyness to the mind that is interfering with the object. So the object can be there, but it's not vibrantly, clearly there. It's just there in sort of a suboptimal way. And this is what, so, we've abandoned laziness, he says. So that could be, we've really started to enjoy the practice. We really start to see benefits from the practice, because those are the reasons why we don't really meditate, is because, kind of seems like a chore. It seems a bit difficult. So, but here on the fourth level, that isn't happening, because our practice is, really starting to go pretty well, and it feels really blissful and joyful and easier. And the objects, and also because he says that we never actually completely lose the object, so that also would support the sessions not being as frustrating as we might find them, where we think, that it's hopeless, and that there's just no ability to progress because we keep losing the object. Once that stops happening, that could certainly reinforce our interest in maintaining our practice. But we have to focus now on the subtler states of laxity and excitement. And then just by continuing, we'll make it to the fifth stage. And he says, here you recognize the advantages of that incredibly stable mind. And even so now coarse laxity is completely overcome. He says that the withdrawal of the mind from extraneous objects now proceeds too far. So it becomes necessary to apply remedies to subtle laxity and thereby heighten the mind. So we've overcome coarse laxity where the mind is too dull, too where the object is very unclear. But we've now gotten to the point where we've progressed in a deep, so these are the kind of deep levels of meditation that we are now able to access, which means that there's a danger of that intensity, not being there, because we are now, before we weren't really able to access these deep levels of the mind, and now we're starting to tap into that. So we might, and what they say is that that can feel really pleasant. It can feel really restorative and enjoyable, but if that leads to not having the intensity that we need, then we'll kind of plateau at the fifth level, because we're just going to kind of get attracted to that peace, that kind of sense of being really, really calm and tranquil. But we have to remember that the intensity of our focus is also really important. So he's saying that these subtle forms of laxity need to be overcome. So we need to brighten the mind, like we had talked about before. Level 6 is pacifying. And he says now on the 6th level, we do overcome subtle laxity. And so here we, through our own experience, we recognize the faults of scattering to, he says, thoughts and destructive emotions. And so subtle laxity poses no danger. However, those very remedies for overcoming subtle laxity by heightening the mind may lead to an overly invigorated mind. And so now there's a danger of generating subtle excitement. So again, it's this sort of balancing of holding the object, but not holding it too tightly, not holding it too loosely, and counteracting what's arising, but only doing it to the level that's necessary, not too much, because as we said before, the antidotes that previously were helpful in overcoming what was arising, the distraction that was arising, now they themselves can become an obstacle, because it's such a small gradation of sort of laxity or excitement that we're dealing with. If you push a little bit too much energy into the mind, now there's just too much going on in the mind. So it's this balancing act that we're doing. And then when we recognize and understand the dangers of subtle excitement, and we overcome subtle excitement, we progress to the 7th level. He says, now, as soon as desire, scattering, laxity, lethargy, and the like, so kind of all of the afflicted, states are produced in even subtle form, you can abandon them through exertion. So now subtle laxity and subtle excitement are no longer an issue. He says effort is now able to stop laxity and excitement so that they cannot damage your concentration, even if they make slight interruptions. So we do still have to notice these very, very subtle obstacles, but then the mind will, through a loosening or through a tightening of the grip on the object, just instantly be able to move back to the object, and it will be there again in a very vibrant, clear way. And then on the eighth level, what distinguishes the eighth level is that exertion, that effort that we were putting in to overcoming those states, now we only have to do that at the beginning of the session. We just have to kind of set up the object with an effortful mind at the very beginning, but then that kind of inertia in the mind will be sufficient to completely avoid any break in meditative equipoise on the object. He says, analyzing whether laxity or excitement are about to arise is no longer needed during the session. Now such exertion can be set aside, but this does not mean loosening the intensely clear mode of perceiving the object. So we just kind of give ourselves the initial push in meditation, and then we're good to go for that session. And then on the ninth level, he says we don't need to apply any effort to cause mindfulness and introspection. He says the mind places itself on the object of its own accord. He says the ninth level is spontaneous. When at the start of the session you set your mind on the object, stability is sustained without interruption through its own force, without needing to rely on even slight initial exertion. You now have no need to apply remedies of any type of laxity to any type of laxity or excitement. So, any thoughts or questions so far? No. So then he talks about, because we've used the phrase fully qualified calm abiding, which is a feature of the ninth level, where by persisting on the ninth level, there is a flexibility of body and mind, of a lightness, a flexibility, and a sense of bliss. So there's a physical and mental sense of bliss and pliancy or flexibility that arises as a person persists on the ninth level. There's nothing beyond the ninth level. In terms of the things that exist beyond the ninth level are form and formless concentrations. that a person can go on to develop. But in terms of this skill of fully qualified calm abiding, you have achieved it on the ninth level in its entirety when the physical and mental bliss and pliancy is also part of your experience of meditation. And they say that this is related to the wind energy of the body. That's always, it's always there, but it flows when this level of concentration is achieved. The winds flow in such a way that they themselves give rise to this experience of physical and mental bliss and pliancy. He says, with fully qualified calm abiding, your mind is powerfully concentrated enough to purify destructive emotions when it is joined with insight. When you enter into meditative equipoise, mental and physical flexibility are quickly generated, and it is as if your mind is mixed with space itself. When you leave meditation, your body is like new to you, and aspects of mental and physical flexibility remain. Outside meditation, your mind is firm like a mountain and so clear that it seems you could count the particles in a wall, and you have fewer counterproductive emotions, being mostly free from desire for pleasant objects, as well as free from any harmful intent. Harmful intent, lethargy, sleepiness, excitement, contrition, and doubt. So all of those are overcome just by having generated fully qualified calm abiding. Lethargy, sleepiness, excitement, contrition, and doubt, as well as desire for pleasant objects and any harmful, any ill will that you might have otherwise generated. Any thoughts or questions?
I'll just comment, your last description of level 9 of calm abiding is certainly highly motivating. I liked it.
Yeah, so Geshe Zopa is going to be teaching on calm abiding starting tomorrow for the next 3 Sundays, inclusive, the 5th, 12th, and 19th from 10 to 11:30 Mountain Time in the morning. So just going over these sorts of things. So that'll be interesting. But yeah, I mean, being able to just meditate at will and have that incredible physical and mental bliss, and I mean, it sounds amazing. Yeah. Any other thoughts or questions? Nope. Okay. So now we are on chapter 10, and here His Holiness is going to kind of start to put all of the things that we've learned so far together. We've looked a bit about the philosophy of dependent arising and emptiness through the first few chapters, and then we looked at the circumstances for developing calm abiding, which is necessary if we want to have a direct, non-conceptual understanding of emptiness or the nature of reality. We can have what they call a correct inferential understanding without fully qualified calm abiding, but we can't have a direct non-conceptual realization without fully qualified calm abiding. So it's necessary to develop calm abiding if that's if we have that as a goal. So he's going to put this together in terms of instruction about how to actually meditate on the emptiness and of things. And so, of course, here he's starting with oneself. We've talked, I think, before, a little bit at least, about how all phenomena, of course, can be described as empty of inherent existence. But of all of those objects, it's most powerful to take oneself as the object that we are analyzing. He says, since it is the individual person who undergoes pleasure and pain, makes trouble and accumulates karma, all the noise and the mess being made by the self, analysis should begin with yourself. Then, when you understand that this person is without inherent existence, you can extend this realization to the things that you enjoy, undergo, and make use of. In this sense, the person is principle. So, because of the afflictions arise in our own mind, and under the influence of afflictions, we engage in actions that have karmic repercussions. And so that is, if we can cut that off, or at least begin to undermine that process, maybe we don't fully realize, the emptiness of the self in this life, but we get imprints of that, and we start to create doubt in the mind about how solid we are. We maybe give ourselves some space, some distance from non-virtue and so on by questioning and interrogating the solidity of the self. So yeah. Okay, so then that's just a real short chapter where His Holiness is just stating that since we're going to try to realize emptiness, we should take oneself as the object that we're going to use to accomplish that. Because once we realize the emptiness of any object, we can extend that, we can generalize that insight to all phenomena. But it's most powerful, most impactful if we take oneself as the object instead of, a flower or some other person. So chapter 11 is called Realizing That You Do Not Exist in and of Yourself, which is again one of the ways of defining that which lacks inherent existence, that which does not exist from its own side or in and of itself. So then he talks about, of course, a conventional self, and which does exist. So he starts off by helping us to make sure that we understand that there is a body and there is a mind, and they are interconnected, interdependent, and as long as that association is continuing, then we are alive in this life, and during that entire time, we are able to talk and learn things and travel places and, have emotions and engage in behaviors. And it's the conventional self that is doing all of those things. And that's no problem for Buddhism. There is, conventionally speaking, a self, an I, that is going around and engaging and relating to things. But there is, he says, the other meaning of self occurs in the term selflessness. So Selflessness is another way of translating emptiness, or it's the selflessness of persons, the selflessness of phenomena, the way in which self and phenomena lack inherent existence. He says this refers to a falsely imagined, over concretized status of existence, which is called inherent existence. The ignorance, he says, that adheres to such an exaggeration is the source of ruination, the mother of all wrong attitudes. In observing the I that depends upon mental and physical attributes, this mind exaggerates it into being inherently existent, despite the fact that the mental and physical elements being observed do not contain any such exaggerated being. So we apprehend the valid, conventionally valid body and mind, and then we layer on top of what is there on this collection of mental aggregates and physical aggregates, we layer on top a status, a concretized, overly independent identity on top of that, which is false, which is, he says, imagined. It's a fiction of the mind that adds a level of solidity to the physical and mental aggregates that they simply do not possess. He says, just as a car exists in dependence upon its parts, so a sentient being is conventionally set up in dependence upon body and mind. There is no person to be found either separate from mind and body or within mind and body. And then he goes on to say that in addition to the parts of body and mind, conventionally there is this act of mental imputation, which we've talked about before, this act of mental designation. So that gives rise to a label, and that label is really the only way in which it exists. So it is you could say it's a car in name only, because the label of car is a mental imputation upon the parts, the causes and conditions that gave rise to the conventionally existing car, but that label carries with it this overly concretized identity where it is as if there is a findable car, a car from its own side, somewhere in that collection of parts. But there really is only just that label given to those parts and those causes and conditions on the basis of an act of mental designation, an act of mental imputation. He says, how can we understand that this perspective, this overly concretized perspective, is a mistaken perspective? He says, focus on the fact that there is nothing within body and mind that can be the quote unquote I. Mind and body are empty of a tangible I. Rather, just as a car is set up in dependence upon its parts and is not even the sum of its parts, so the I depends upon body and mind. An I without depending on body and mind does not exist, whereas an I that is understood to be dependent upon body and mind exists in accordance with the conventions of the world. He says, understanding this type of quote unquote I that is not at all to be found within body and mind, and is not even the sum of mind and body, but exists only through the power of its name and our thoughts is helpful as we strive to see ourselves as we really are. Any thoughts or questions? Nope. So then he's going to go, because we're still on this section of taking oneself as the object that we're using to realize emptiness. So he's going to talk now about what's called the 4-point analysis, the way that we deconstruct the I and look for what seems to be there. We have this intuitive sense that there must be an I, there must be a findable, pointable, identifiable ego identity that is the owner of body and mind. That's our conventional, that's our sort of subjective baseline assumption that we just have about ourselves. And so we, if that's true, then when we look for what we kind of have a intuitive sense of, then we would be able to locate it. We'd be able to say, okay, this is specifically why I do have this view about myself. So he says, the I appears to our minds to be established in and of itself. And when we use analysis to try to find it, it is not found. It seems that the I does not exist at all, whereas it is only the independent I, the inherently existent I, that does not exist. So he talks about we don't want to go too far and say that because I don't exist in the way that I seem to myself to exist, then therefore I don't exist at all, which can lead to denying karma, can lead to, denying rebirth. So that would be going into the extreme of nihilism, which is negating too much. So he says it is crucial as a first step to understand what is being negated in selflessness. He says, so here we try to identify. So the first thing is, again, to establish what we, in the very beginning, we talked about this idea of establishing the object to be negated. So here, with this analysis, in order to not go too far and negate too much, we have to recognize that we're only trying to negate a self that seems to not depend upon body and mind, to be independent of body and mind, to be set up under its own power, existing from its own side. So to do that, typically what they say is to think of, so if you're doing a specific session of meditation on the emptiness of the self, you would start that by causing the object to be refuted to become very clear in your mind. You're not trying to prove that you don't exist at all. So you're trying to disprove the concretized ego identity. And this concretized ego identity is easiest to discern or ascertain during certain experiences. Those experiences tend to be times when we feel a sense of shame or embarrassment or fear or righteous indignation. Those are all times when this false overly concretized identity is really powerful. It's really, really asserts itself in a very dominant way. So we literally would try to remember a not so traumatizing time when something like that happened. When we, we had a near miss on the road. We thought there was going to be a terrible collision, but we avoided it. Or maybe we were swimming in the ocean and we got held down by a wave and we were, struggling to surface. Or we had to give some sort of presentation and we forgot our notes, or we just went blank and couldn't remember what we were trying to convey, and there was silence and maybe some chuckles directed toward us, so whatever it might be, when there was again a sense of fear or shame or embarrassment, or as I said, righteous indignation. So somebody accuses us of doing something that we did not do, and they, because if we did it, then we're like, yeah, you got me. I mean, we might, if we're worried about the consequences, we might deny that it happened, or but we know that we did it, so we're not happy about it. But that's very different than if the police knocked, broke down your door and accused you of some terrible crime that you didn't commit, and then you get hauled off into an interrogation room for 12 hours. And that's the kind of righteous indignation that I mean, where you're wrongfully accused of something, and stealing something from someone or whatever it might be. And you're just like, how dare you, say that to me? Or, sometimes it could be, you're kind of verbally attacked, or, and then you're like, how dare you treat me like that? Or how, because you feel aggrieved, you feel wronged in some way. So that kind of experience is, these are the times. Of course, Buddhism would say, rightly so, that this false ego identity is always present in the mind, but it is easiest to identify in meditation when we're using a memory that falls into one of these categories. I would assume over time, we also need to get better at identifying it in subtler circumstances when it's harder to identify. But to start with, these are the times when we can point at it most clearly without a lot of effort. So we literally try to bring up a memory that's not going to disturb the mind much, and then use that as the object to be negated. Trying to think, oh, in this moment, I felt like whatever was happening was hitting a real me, that sense of fear, that sense of embarrassment. It's like an arrow that was shot at me, and it actually hit a findable target in that moment, because there was a findable target there to be hit by that experience. So that is the kind of overly concretized ego identity that's a fiction of the mind. And then he quotes the fifth Dalai Lama. The 14th Dalai Lama is quoting himself as the fifth Dalai Lama when he says, Sometimes the quote unquote I will seem to exist in the context of the body. Sometimes it will seem to exist in the context of the mind. Sometimes it will seem to exist in the context of feelings, discriminations, or other factors. At the end of noticing a variety of modes of appearance, you will come to identify a quote unquote I that exists in its own right, that exists inherently, that from the start is self-established, existing undifferentiatedly with body, with mind and body, which are also mixed like milk and water. This is the first step, ascertainment of the object to be negated in the view of selflessness. You should work at it until deep experience arises. So he's saying even, before we get to the deconstructing of this ego identity, we need to spend a lot of time and energy just on this first initial step, clearly identifying the object to be refuted, the object to be negated. If we don't get that step correct, then we might be analyzing the wrong kind of object, which is not going to lead us to the right result of recognizing the emptiness of the ego identity. So it's critically important that we, give a lot of time and attention to this by, using different memories, different, because there's a difference between somebody saying, there's a different kind of uh, aggrievement that might arise if someone says that we're stupid versus if someone says that we're, short or unattractive or overweight or, whatever they might. We hold different qualities of body and mind in different levels of regard. So different experiences that bring into play those might give us a fuller picture of how this ego identity is arising, in the mind. Because sometimes if someone says, "Oh, your hair, doesn't look good," or "Oh, you know, whatever," then that kind of insult is going to cause a strong identification in that moment with our physical body, because that's what's being brought up. But then if they talk about, in a negative way, a quality of our mind, our generosity or our intelligence or whatever it might be, now we're going to identify not with the body in that moment, but with the mind, and think, well, no, I am like this. That's not true that I don't have this quality, or that I'm lazy, or whatever. That's a false perception of who I really am. And but both of those are valid. Both we hold that sense of is aggrievement a word? I think it might be. Anyway, we hold that sense, just at different points in time, but we hold them both. But we're not always holding them at all times. So recognizing how we solidify and concretize this type of experience and this other type of experience can give a more complete picture to how in total we've constructed a ego identity that overly exaggerates body and mind. Uh, any thoughts or questions? Okay. So we'll keep going a little bit further. So now we're in chapter 12, where he said, now we have figured out how we appear to our own mind. Um, and then he says, after you have identified the sense that objects exist from power within themselves, like we have done now with the ego identity, then when you study about and meditate on selflessness and emptiness, the way is open for some understanding of the absence of over-concretized existence to dawn in your mind. However, without knowing how objects appear to have such a status and how you ascend to it, you might have the impression that the great treatises are just trying to force us to accept what they're saying. He says, therefore, keep coming back to that first step, since as your knowledge deepens, your estimation of the target being investigated will become more and more subtle. That's kind of like what I was saying before. We'll ultimately need to be able to pinpoint this ego identity even when we're just bored, or even when we're just kind of mindlessly driving. It's very quiet at that time, but it's still present. It never disappears. That this overly concretized ego identity is present even in our dreams. It's present. So probably we even need to figure out, for it to become enlightened, I would imagine you even have to identify how it appears in a concretized way in deep meditation and in dreams and so on, when it's very, very subtle. But he's saying that we use our own direct experience of recollecting this false I, in order to see that it is a false I. So then he says since we're going to deconstruct or analyze this appearance and its relationship to valid reality, we have to set the ground rules for how we're going to conduct that analysis. What does it mean to search for this false I that does seem to appear so strongly to the mind? And that is looking for the I in 4 different places. So to come to agree with the idea that if this false, overly concretized identity is valid, then it has to be findable either in the body or in the mind, or in the combination of body and mind, or completely separate from body and mind, from body and or mind. So entirely divorced from either body or mind. And that there's no 5th place where you would want to look, that is inclusive of every possible option. One with the body, one with the mind, one with the combination of body and mind, or entirely separate from body and or mind. So we just have to kind of spend some time deciding that, yeah, if we were gonna, that we do this recollection, these memories where this really strong, assertive ego identity has arisen, and then we're like, okay, I can clearly remember, maybe even just yesterday, when this happened, and it was like there really was a findable I. And so if I'm going to say that that's true, that that's valid, that that's real, then when I look for what is arising to my own mind so clearly, I have to be able to find it in one of those four places, that there's no fifth place, that if I can't find it in these four places, then I can be satisfied, I can be certain that I've demonstrated that it does not exist. It would be like if you went into a room and the door sealed behind you, so you can't get out, and then you drop something, and then you like fell asleep, then you woke up, and there was a video camera though that was filming the room, and nobody came in, nobody came out, no doors open, no windows opened, nothing changed. You could be certain that whatever it was you dropped, whatever it was that you dropped was still in that room, and that all you have to do to locate it is look every single square inch of that room. That there's no reason to think, well, okay, I looked in every single square inch of this room, but maybe it's outside. You would have the certainty that if it exists, it is findable in that room and not any other place in the universe could it possibly be. And then if you don't find it, you would have to conclude that what you thought you brought into that room was a hallucination, that you didn't actually drop what you thought you dropped, that you had a false memory of bringing it with you. It's really, you never actually did that because you've now not found it. You've looked for it in every single square inch of that room, and it can't be elsewhere, and it is not there. Therefore, even though you think you have a clear memory of bringing it into the room and dropping it, it isn't possible. That cannot be what happened. That's what we have to do before we can move on to looking within those four places, is just decide that for the purposes of this analysis, that what I'm trying to do is recollect the arising of that ego identity in its concretized form, and then determine that in order for that to have been a valid experience, what I experienced can only be locatable in one of these four places. So that's my job. My job then is to really thoroughly investigate all four of those possibilities. And if it so happens at the end of that process that no such identity was findable, then I have no escape. I have no ability to have an out, or to say to somehow rescue my perception of myself in that way. I must conclude that, yeah, it did. I experienced it like that, but that experience isn't based in reality. That experience isn't valid. It's something that the mind just elaborated on top of what is valid, what is real, what is findable, what is identifiable. So that just takes, it's relatively straightforward, that there can't really be a fifth category, that we haven't done the analysis yet, of course. We're just defining the ground rules. We're just saying that I only need to do that. I only need to determine these four places, because what could be a fifth category? We've looked at the body, we've looked at the mind, we've looked at the combination of body and mind. And then the fourth category is anything that's not body and or mind. That's a pretty catch-all kind of category. So yeah, and so then once we have a really clear certainty that that's the job, that that's what's necessary, we just go about engaging in that analysis, which is what comes next. Any thoughts or questions? Nope. I think maybe we'll leave it there for today rather than trying to go into starting that analysis. So if there's anything that might be helpful from what's been addressed, we could look at it. I just don't want to start a brand new kind of thing with not too much time left. Anything that would be useful? Nope. All right. So then, like I say, I think we'll leave it there for today.
Thank you for the presentation.
Sure. All right. So we'll just end with dedicating. So again, recollect your own motivation that you established and think that by having listened and participated, you've actualized that motivation, which has created positive energy in the mind, and have a sense of offering that positive energy, letting go of the fruit of your efforts, and thinking that strongly may it ripen for the benefit of countless sentient beings. Visualizing very vividly, very strongly all of the vast and beneficial ways that you'd like to see it ripen. All of the incredible benefits arising. All right. Well, we will carry on next week.